Hello and welcome to my talk about clinical trial methods in non-pharmacological therapies. I'll be focusing on physical interventions, rehabilitation interventions, and particular on the challenge of controlling for placebo and expectancy effects in those trials. Before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers and specifically Professor Bennell for inviting me, and I hope you've had a good meeting so far. My main conflict of interest is probably the fact that I'm also an allied health provider, as we call it in the UK, more specifically an osteopath. So I do potentially have an interest in the good standing of that profession, both through income from education and clinical practice, although I try to be as critical as possible in my research work, of course. I don't think any of the other interests declared here have any bearing on what I'm about to tell you. Briefly going through the structure of the talk, and I'll try and make it as crisp as possible because I do think we learn most from thinking about this in the context of our own research endeavors or clinical practice, and then leave enough time to discuss those examples in a question and answer session afterwards. But I'll start off with focusing on mechanistic considerations, both in terms of what placebo effects are, but also what how we think mechanistically about the studies that we investigate, about the treatments that we investigate. And then we also look at evidence for placebo effects in the kind of trials that we're conducting. We use that then to move into implications for clinical trials and ask how can we and why should we design control interventions. But I also want to briefly dwell on pragmatic trials because I don't think they need to be dissociated from more efficacy-focused studies, and I think they can actually complement one another. And afterwards we dwell on briefly how to interpret different trials, but also how to compare them potentially differently to drug trials. So let's start off with reflecting on the kind of clinical interventions that we're often interested in, and I was told in your case that's mainly rehabilitation interventions, so it could be physical activities. You may have come across a few manual therapy approaches, certainly dry needling, potentially various device-based interventions, and there's also lifestyle and communication-based interventions that I argue we can put together in the sense that they share some features that make them interesting but also challenging for us to study. And I would argue that this includes that they are all often very personal interventions that rely on interaction between patients and providers. Sometimes that's in person, sometimes that's in groups, sometimes that's online. And they all are complex in the sense that they contain more than one step. And often they also contain more than one session. They often over longer periods of time in their delivery. Some of those aspects are quite repetitive. Other therapies go through a journey, more or less. You could also look at those as quite ritualistic in the sense that they have particular actions that are clearly out of the ordinary for the observer, but also for the patient, and that are repetitive. That's what you would call a ritualistic experience. And if you put yourself sort of in the position of the little man from out of space and you think about what it would look like for the uninitiated to observe, for example, a manual therapy intervention or a series of those, there are quite a few ritualistic elements in there. For patients, these therapies are often also multisensorial. They engage all sorts of senses. That includes the physical sense, of course, balance, etc. It can be the touch sense, but also includes smell, vision, hearing, different clinical settings in which these interventions are typically conducted. The reasoning of those interventions is also often quite explicit. Whether those rationales and those mechanistic explanations are correct or not doesn't matter so much for our purposes here, but often something is communicated in terms of explanations and why something's wrong and why those interventions are supposed to work to the patient. if I think of my own patients, but also my own family, for example, they go and see particular therapists and particular interventions largely based on recommendation by a trusted other. Less so really on the recommendation of a healthcare professional often, to be honest. And also whether people come back or not, I think depends a lot on whether they had a good or a not so good experience. More on a personal level rather than an effectiveness level sometimes. Depending on the setting, whether public healthcare setting or private, these interventions can be quite expensive to the individual, and they are often site-specific, like I said, whether that's your yoga studio, your exercise rehab studio, your hospital, or your manual therapy private practice. You tend to come into a particular clinical setting for these interventions. Now, I've dwelled quite long on this, and apologies if my video is in the way of the text here. What I'm intending to say is that these interventions are all quite rich in their context, and they convey meaning. And this idea of a meaning for experience links quite nicely over to the topic of placebo effects. And the placebo effect in 2002 was coined also, or called the meaning response by Dan Merman. He said that these non-specific effects largely link to the perceived meaning of the individual. And in the same year, Lene Vase from Aarhus in Denmark said that it's largely the subject's perception of the placebo agent, so of that supposedly inert therapy, that seems to be central to the magnitude of pain relief that patients get from the administration of these interventions. And mechanistically, the driving force of the extent of placebo analgesia seem to be expectations. So whether or not consciously or subconsciously the experience and the perceived meaning leads to positive or negative expectations seems to be the best predictor of the extent of placebo effects. These expectations, like I said, can be conscious, but there are also more traditional conditioning mechanisms at play here that include subconscious stimulus pairing, as in Pavlov's dog experiments, or observational learning, including, in other words, social learning, where you observe someone else getting better and getting benefits, and that leads to similar expectations for you. Now, before we talk about placebo effects a little more in the context of the interventions that we're looking at, I'd like to briefly dwell on this model of clinical evidence and different sources of clinical evidence or different research designs that can inform our clinical and also healthcare policy decision making. So this little graph intends to communicate that it's a circular model rather than an either or a linear approach. In pharmacological trials, there's often different, where you have a consecutive approach to study design leading from initial proof of concept or mechanistic biological studies all the way to post market approval surveillance studies. In our field, we often have the scenario that, for example, pragmatic comparative effectiveness trials are conducted before we really understand whether an intervention works through placebo effects largely or through the mechanisms that we suppose to be at play here. And these different designs answer different research questions, and I'd argue that all of those research questions have some merit. Placebo-controlled RCTs, or typically called the traditional RCT, often efficacy trials, ask whether a treatment works under ideal circumstances or whether it works better than placebo administration. Mechanistic experiments ask how a treatment works. That can be as part of a randomized controlled trial or as your classical sort of lab or healthy volunteer experiment. And then on the other end of the explanatory pragmatic spectrum are trials that seek to answer questions such as whether a treatment works for a particular group of patients or in a particular type of setting. And we'll talk about those a little bit more later on. But importantly, many of those studies are also comparative effectiveness trials that ask whether a treatment is better than another approach or better than usual care. Staying on the topic of efficacy trials for the largest part of this presentation, we certainly have a challenge in non-pharmacological and complex interventions. For one, we have a lack of efficacy data. We have few trials that seek to study interventions in a quite closely controlled context and compared to a control intervention that seeks to tease out specific effects from expectancy effects. So there are not many of those studies, and if they exist, then often they are criticized for their low quality. And we dwell on some of those problems in a moment. It's really blinding and placebo control methods that are often used or identified as the primary issue with methodological quality in this field. If you look at drug trials, the concept of a placebo-controlled trial is pretty straightforward. You know what your pharmacological ingredient is in almost all cases, and you take that out of the pill and produce a pill that looks and smells and tastes the same as your medication, and then you administer that to two groups of patients. But how would you transfer this principle to, for example, the complex interventions that you see here? What often happens is that something else is used as a therapy that's quite easily switched off, quite literally. So for example, a shockwave or an ultrasound device that you can't turn off but make it look as if it was still switched on. And that's certainly in the rehab field, probably I'd argue the most common placebo or sham control, as we call that. By the way, just on terminology, I'll be talking about controlled interventions in the context of efficacy trials from here on, rather than placebo or sham control methods, because these terms have been identified as potentially challenging, as I'll tell you later on. So with this in mind, a few years ago now, I set out as part of my PhD at Imperial College in London to develop guidance for control interventions in efficacy and mechanistic trials. Before we go there, let's briefly remind ourselves of the definitions that are relevant in this context. So first of all, we talk about placebo and nocebo effects, in the sense that we mean changes that are specifically attributable to placebo and nocebo mechanisms. That includes the neurobiological and psychological equivalence of expectancies and changes in expectations. And these mechanisms can be influenced, for example, by verbal instruction, but also through all those contextual cues that we looked at when I started the talk. In contrast, the placebo and nocebo response includes any kind of changes in symptoms after the administration of an inactive treatment. And that includes the natural history of symptoms and statistical phenomena such as regression to the mean. If we look at that in a graph, you can identify that over time, people usually, especially in painful conditions, often tend to get better after inclusion in a trial. So even with no treatment, you'll see some kind of improvement in whatever you're measuring. That improvement will be larger in people who also have a placebo administered, and it's that difference between the no treatment group and the placebo group that we call the placebo effect. The placebo response, as you see on the far right of this slide, also includes the reasons that lead to improvement in the no treatment group. And an efficacy trial then really asks whether a treatment has more benefit than what you get in the placebo group. Now let's talk about those placebo control interventions, and the idea really being to translate that principle of drug trials where you take out the active pharmacological ingredient to non-pharmacological intervention trials. And I'd argue that there are a few problems when translating this principle. First, the mechanism of many of those physical and psychological therapies is often unclear. For example, in the field of manuotherapy, but also in psychological interventions, we often don't know what might lead to treatment effects, or there are multiple pretty unfounded theories that often compete with one another. Where we do have some idea of mechanisms, such as, for example, in rehabilitation trials, where you do have some good mechanistic studies, for example, studying whether an improvement in strength actually leads to better health outcomes, or core stability leads to pain improvements in a back pain population. There we certainly do have some mechanistic understanding of those interventions, but rarely do we have one single mechanism that we could isolate. For example, is it only the strength component, or is there also a motor control element in there, or are there other factors that we would probably consider contextual but also not quite placebo, so expectancy related, such as endorphin release, going out into the light, interacting with others, etc. So to start with, it's difficult to identify an active ingredient or a mechanism of action. We also have the situation that many of those therapies depend quite prominently on the action of a provider or practitioner. In a scientific context, that means that we want to convince somebody to deliver a treatment that they probably don't quite believe in, a controlled intervention, with the same attitude, conviction as they would for their professional background and their own therapy. And then lastly, it's also rarely the case that the control interventions that we can design are truly inert, as you probably could make an argument for sugar pills. Indeed, what is a control intervention in some scenario, for example, soft touch in a manuotherapy treatment or trial, is often or can be the active treatment in another study. So therapeutic touch is a concept in itself, and it doesn't require the big mobilization of joints or deep soft tissue massage. It's really about acknowledging that touch, specifically so soft stroking, human touch can have beneficial effects on health outcomes. So how do we incorporate that either into our design but also in our interpretation of the findings from those studies? Now we can also ask, does it actually matter whether control interventions lead to blinding? So does it matter whether the control intervention is able to convince somebody that this might be an active treatment, or at least keep them in the dark about whether or not they get the control intervention or the test treatment? So here's probably the most cited study on that topic, where Robertson and colleagues compared trials with blinded participants to trials with unblinded participants, and as a result made quite a strong argument for the importance of blinding. But I do think the current state of affairs is a bit more complicated than that. For example, in that study from that Norwegian group, we can't always be certain that people in the control intervention arm that were supposed to be blind were actually blinded. And in fact, that's almost never measured, let alone reported. I consider currently the best source of evidence on blinding. This is a meta-epidemiological review, so a review of reviews, where the authors looked at a whole range of studies, and they conclude that at the moment there's low certainty evidence of an effect of blinding, so that trials that are unblinded tend to overestimate the treatment effect at a modest effect size. And they also caution about the interpretation of results of trials that are not blinded. So I would summarize this as it's currently probably a good idea to blind participants in trials or to at least attempt this. And I also would like to make the argument that control interventions can't just lead to participant blinding, but they are ideally balancing contextual factors by matching them between control arms and intervention arms, and therefore producing similar placebo effects in both groups. More importantly at this point, I think, is an argument for standardization, which will enable us to use trials as part of evidence synthesis endeavors. And I do think as a clinical trialist, it's really important to think about your own individual research project as a piece in a larger puzzle. And the more we can standardize, the more we can compare and hopefully reduce research waste and just make more use out of the research data that we produce. So let's look at that placebo effect, specifically at how big it might be. That's often a question that's asked, and there are some historical studies that would say about 1/3 of participants in a trial expect or get a considerable placebo effect. And what we did in this systematic review here is we used 3-armed trials that have the benefit of having a no treatment group, which, as you saw from the graph earlier, would then allow us to tease out the placebo effect, so distinguish placebo expectancy related effects from natural history improvements. And that's what we did in 17 randomized controlled trials, many of which manual or rehabilitation trials, manual therapy or rehabilitation trials. And we found an overall treatment effect, so comparing the treatment arm to the no treatment arm of 0.54, which is sort of a moderate effect size, and comparing placebo arms or control intervention arms to the no treatment arm, we found a small effect. But in relation to the overall effect, that was quite a considerable contribution of indeed about 1/3, or well over 1/3 here. We were able to subgroup that and tease apart a little bit, and what we found was that the control interventions that used manual therapy or hands-on based control approaches produced much larger placebo effects than the other two groups that we had. So, like I said earlier, there are often studies that use disabled ultrasound devices and other electronic devices as a control condition. They led to much smaller blue here placebo effects, but the same was true in a group of miscellaneous control interventions that use things like white noise or immersion in a floating tank or some educational unrelated attention control interventions. And important here, if you only compare the size of the bars between the manual control group and the other group, you could conclude that those treatments are similarly effective. And if you compare placebo to the active treatment, so the purple part here, you would say that the group, the studied treatments in the other group are much more efficacious than the manual therapy interventions. But what you really need to know about these trials is that one control intervention led to much larger placebo effects than the others. So a really good argument for looking carefully at the design of control interventions. And that's exactly what we did in a much larger systematic review here, where we looked at 2-armed or more armed trials really of sham or placebo-controlled trials, as they called them, of physical, psychological and self-management interventions for people who experience pain. And the aim was to describe the methods used in those designs, but also for the first time to quantify and assess the relationship between how those control interventions were designed and what the studies found in terms of clinical outcomes. We included almost 200 trials, and what you can see in this slightly confusing, admittedly, graph is that we mainly set out to compare the control intervention to the tested intervention across 25 different features that we had identified as potentially relevant beforehand from the literature. So let's look at that top part here. The further to the right that chart is, or that bar is, the more comparable, the more similar the control intervention to the test intervention for this particular feature. And those 7 features here really are mainly to do with the amount and the extent of treatment. So across different types of therapies, which are indicated by the different colors here, things like treatment duration, but also the type of environment in which control and test intervention happened in, were usually quite similar. Now, if we go back to that chart and look at the lower part of the graph, we can see that these features were much less similar on average, and also that we start to see quite a difference between different types of interventions. I don't want to dwell too much on this type of on this analysis, and would invite you to look at the primary papers, but basically we can say that there's no standardization in how controlled interventions are designed. We also try to identify why people designed those controlled interventions the way they did. What did they say about their rationale and reasoning? And very, very rarely do you see any justification for how controlled interventions were designed, or even what the objectives of those controlled interventions were, whether it was to balance placebo effects, match contextual factors, or lead to participant blinding. It's often in the dark. The content and the rationale, but also quality assurance, are insufficient. Quality assurance, for example, being testing whether the control interventions achieve the objective that you intended it to achieve. So whether it led to participant blinding or to comparable expectations between groups. I won't show you the detail of the meta-regression analyses that we did, but by and large, how a control intervention is designed, and specifically whether it resembles or is distinct for different features from the tested intervention, influences outcomes significantly. So we finished the mechanistic part of this talk. I hope you've by now been reminded of what placebo effects are, how they might differ from placebo responses, but mainly I hope you got the idea that the types of interventions that we're interested in have a huge potential for placebo effects, and that those placebo effects are significant contributors to overall effect sizes that we see in clinical practice, but also that how you design a control intervention has an impact on the findings of a trial, and specifically on the comparability with other trials. So let's use that knowledge and go into clinical trial design and look at some recommendations that we developed in this context. The approach of my PhD, which this project or which this talk is largely based on, was to describe the problem and then move on to making recommendations. And by now we're in the field of, or more in the realm of communicating those recommendations and trying them ourselves to collect experiences with that. So we've seen the systematic review and meta-analysis that was at the base of all of this, and we used this information to feed it into a Delphi study, and that's how I had the pleasure of meeting Kim Bennell or Rana Hinman as well. They were kindly contributors of this Delphi study. We also had interviews with various stakeholders that I'll talk to you about, used that to then inform a consensus workshop, and the result of this is the so-called COPS statement, which was published last year in the BMJ, and I'd really invite you to look that up. I'll provide a link to that as well at the end, or QR code rather. So let's, before we look at the content of that COPS statement, I want to highlight how many people contributed to this. I merely facilitated some of that, but it's really the input of these clinical trialists and research experts on the placebo effect that made this a successful endeavor. And it was quite a lengthy process, so I appreciate that a lot of people have put in quite a lot of time. So as I alluded to, we used experts both from the clinical trial domain, but also experts who studied the placebo effect, so who understood the phenomenon that those controlled interventions aim to control for. We had 3 rounds of anonymous surveys, where in each round you got feedback from the previous round, so you adjusted ideally your rating a little bit, which then led to consensus. In the end, 48 participants completed all of those rounds, and that resulted in 68 recommendation items that were then turned into clinical scenarios that were discussed with people who with lived experience of persistent pain, asking them about how they would feel if they were a participant in such a hypothetical clinical trial. And all of that was then used to inform a manuscript that was discussed at consensus meetings that was online, and in the end the result is the so-called COP statement, which aims to standardize the conceptual development, the practical development, and the conduct of efficacy and mechanistic trials in physical and psychological interventions, specifically the control intervention design here. We also touched on terminology. As I said earlier, certain terms we discouraged, specifically sham and placebo, where possible. We discussed how patients and other stakeholders can be involved from the beginning to the end of those endeavors. And we adapted or modified the tidier placebo reporting checklist. So there is an existing reporting checklist for control interventions, and we modified that further for the purposes of physical and psychological interventions. That reporting checklist was adopted by the Equator Network, so you also find the COP statement in this library of reporting guidelines. So if we look at some of those domains together, the conceptual development, so really before you do anything practically, is often a matter of reading up on your intervention and of being quite clear about the content and the theory behind your intervention. And then you want to use that to define the objectives of the control interventions, define the mechanisms of interest in your study treatment, and then specify the components of the intervention that you think act on those mechanisms. So what part of the strengthening or rehab program is it that leads to the mechanistic change that you think is linked to the clinical outcomes? And then the key part of the COP statement really is this similarity statement here, or similarity principle, which states that the control intervention should replicate as many components of the investigated treatment as possible, apart from those components whose effect the trial aims to study. So there are a few things in here. One is, well, it sounds quite logical, but as I've just shown you, in many randomized controlled trials, the similarity really is not a given. If you take those switched off ultrasound devices or very dissimilar control interventions in psychological trials, it's certainly shouldn't be taken for granted. And also, it's a nuance here, but there could be multiple components in whose effect you are interested. So the COP statement doesn't prohibit you or discourage you to study more than one mechanism at a time. But as you see in a practical example later, that certainly leads to further challenges. The practical development and the piloting phase were highlighted as absolutely crucial to ensuring that the controlled intervention can actually do what it intends to do. And I appreciate from a practical point of view that just adds to the bulk of work that you have to do when you plan a protocol, when you apply for funding, when you actually set up a trial. I'm just going through that myself with some providers, but I'm very grateful that we're doing all of this, because so many of those challenges you can't anticipate until you actually try it out and until you actually get the feedback from the people who you expect to deliver the control intervention or from the patients who receive it. And part of that provider training is really for them to understand that what we're trying to do with that and how that's ethically and scientifically justifiable. And I think what I've experienced now is once you get people to that point, they start taking ownership of that research project and find it quite exciting, and hopefully feel more comfortable with delivering something that's not ideal in their view from a therapeutic context. That also applies to other staff involved. So whoever you can't blind, you do need to educate them. Well, even the people you can blind, you do need to educate them to the importance of maintaining that blinding and communicating equally, no matter in which group or which code you know that participants have. And then when it comes to the conduct, a lot of it is about assessing whether what you've put into place is actually happening in the trial, so monitoring fidelity of the intervention, but also participants' adherence should be monitored and then compared between groups, as it might give you an indication about whether or not your control intervention was acceptable and deliverable. And that's a big difference to most of the existing guidelines, is that we do think that participant blinding, if it's an objective, must be assessed. So that's relatively straightforward, asking participants to guess in which group they were at the end of a study, or at some point at least. And where appropriate, you can also measure expectations. The measurement of expectations and how to do that is a bit more complicated, and there's probably no best approach at this point in time, but it should be attempted. Now, just a couple of slides on pragmatic trials, and before, or as an introduction to that, I want to remind us of where we sit with efficacy trials that we aim to control for placebo effects and ask quite specific research questions. But certainly there are also important questions to be asked around clinical practice and how something might work in different populations or under the circumstances of routine care. And to do that, I was part of another consensus process under the auspices of the Impact Initiative, and that's published in Pain last year, and another paper is currently in production, so do keep an eye out for that. Now, pragmatic trials are often misunderstood as trials that are simply like or happen in clinical practice. I think a better definition, and that's also in line with the originators or the founders of that concept, is to say that these trials aim to quite directly inform clinical or policy decision making. So that could be comparing two different interventions, comparing a new intervention to usual care, studying what happens if you change clinical processes, etc. But also applying interventions to new or different populations. So that all certainly informs what you do in clinical practice, or whether you recommend a treatment on at a population level or not. But we've done a systematic review of pragmatic trials, and about a third of those use so-called placebo or attention control interventions. That's certainly something that's highly debated in the pragmatic trials field. Are those placebo-controlled trials pragmatic in the widest sense, or in their definition? I would always say, well, if it changes your clinical practice, then probably it's a pragmatic research question to ask whether something whether treatment effect consists solely of expectancy effects. But that's not something that's settled, certainly. It doesn't matter too much for our purposes. I just want to point out again that pragmatic trials or comparative effectiveness trials often are very common in non-pharmacological trials. And the inability to blind participants, or the supposed inability, is one of the one of the key reasons why pragmatic trial design is justified. So you do have the scenario that that there are pragmatic trials for interventions of which we have no or very poor evidence of efficacy, so effects beyond placebo effects. And that's in particular in the psychological field, but also in the rehab field, very, very common. I said pragmatic trials are often misunderstood as being similar to clinical practice. It's better to phrase it in a way to say that the objective to inform clinical decision making sometimes requires pragmatic trials to emulate, replicate, or be embedded within routine clinical care. So we should probably look at a spectrum where on one end you've got highly controlled methods where you try to really limit what can happen, for example, with regards to how the treatment is applied or how outcomes are measured or who is recruited to the study, to the other end of the spectrum where, again, across various domains, from recruitment to the choice of outcome measures to the intervention delivery, adherence requirements, etc., where you've got much more flexibility in that. And that's probably the pragmatic end, which tends to look a bit more like clinical practice, where we don't reinforce many of those domains too stringently. But the important thing here is that you can have a trial that is very pragmatic in one domain, but very explanatory and controlled in another. So probably the whole concept of pragmatic trials being a bit challenging as an umbrella term. With that in mind, the Impact Initiative led to a couple of recommendations, and one of them, or probably the key one, being that it requires the balancing of heterogeneity with internal validity requirements. So heterogeneity often used as something that is thought to enhance generalizability of findings, so whether or not it applies in settings outside of the study. But at the same time, these impact statements argue that internal validity, so whether you can have confidence in the findings of a trial, is also important. And balancing those needs to be aligned with the research question. That statement from Ford and Norrie in a New England Journal of Medicine editorial is quite good as well, in the sense that they say that pragmatism shouldn't be misunderstood as a laissez-faire approach to trial conduct. It's really to inform clinical practice, and you can only do that with high quality trials. And if you read those impact statements, we try to define a high quality pragmatic trial. Some of those recommendations include defining clearly why you conduct this trial and what it aims to show, or what it aims to study, and then considering the impact of each design choice on the ability to answer this research question. So do we need broad eligibility criteria to answer the research question, or is this a domain where we can focus on internal validity and feasibility in order to and still are able to answer our research question. We also advocate for the use of, in line with that, we advocate for the use of internal validity promoting methods where possible, and that includes blinding. And we do talk in this first paper about innovative trial methods, for example, such as adaptive designs to enhance efficiency, because often you need larger samples. That comes with its own challenges, obviously. And pain-specific recommendations are in production at the moment, hopefully out in the next few weeks. So with that, I just want to end on a practical example. I said I'm training providers at the moment. We're recruiting now for a study that's called the new OARSI study, where we developed a multimodal treatment for people with painful diabetic neuropathy. That's delivered by manual therapists who had specific 2-day training in that intervention. And that's a 3-armed feasibility study asking feasibility questions, but also that includes whether a control intervention, specifically designed control intervention, is feasible and can lead to blinding, for example. And this control intervention, like I said earlier, identified a couple of components of interest. They are across manual therapy techniques, psychologically informed techniques, acceptance commitment therapy based techniques, and an exercise program. And we've taken out the components that we thought would lead to clinical effects and matched everything else. Matched everything else. That included a lot of involvement of patients and of the trial providers during the development, and some training with regards to standardizing the approach across providers And we will have, as the trial goes on, mentoring and regular sessions where the controlled intervention delivery is certainly one of the topics. And we will be testing for the effectiveness of blinding. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and leave you with a couple of reflections in a weird order. I'd start with saying that what we did in those research endeavors or guideline developments certainly doesn't make trials in your field less challenging, but it identified those challenges and it requires us to acknowledge those and find dedicated solutions that can address those challenges. I'd say that with more comparability and more standardization, hopefully comes more trust in trial designs. And that includes being more transparent from a researcher perspective, maybe really using supplements or online registrations to demonstrate transparency and a clear rationale for anyone who really wants to understand what you were doing. And then using quality assurance methods such as measuring blinding after or during a trial. I do think we need to change how we interpret trials and especially how we compare different types of trials. So can we expect the same effect size from a comparative effectiveness trial as we are looking for in a highly matched control intervention trial, or can we expect the same effect size from drug trials as we would see in drug trials? These are all sort of open questions worth thinking about, and I hope we can have a brief discussion on that right now. Thank you. I also said that I'm disseminating the COP statement a little bit at the moment. So if you scan this QR code, that gets you to the COP statement. And it also gets you to a brief feedback questionnaire. I'd highly appreciate it if you could fill that in. It's a half a minute's work. And with that, I'm going to thank my supervisors and many collaborators, including all the members of the COPs and impact groups, but also the volunteers, many volunteers, junior researchers who contributed to those big systematic reviews as part of a systematic review crowd. Thank you.